This is The Common Denominator, and I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. Welcome back to The Common Denominator. I'm Ilana Rachel Daniel. In last week's episode, we heard the first part of the historical model which brings a balanced, and therefore entirely new, framework to the past 100 years of Jews in the land of Israel. To recap part one of our discussion, Professor Francisco Gil-White illustrates for us the documented dynamics on the ground in British Mandate Palestine, one where the voluntary and enthusiastic sale of land to the Jews of the early Yishuv resulted in the increased quality of life for the local Arabs and Jews already living there. So much so that Arab immigration into the land of Israel increased dramatically for those throughout the region, seeking better quality and conditions of life. We learned that the Arab elite was far from on board with the creation of an Arab middle class, and how that elite worked together with the British to aid and abet terror so savage and overwhelming that it would, and did, threaten the existence of the future fledgling state before it was even realized in its modern formation. We met arch-villain Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, whose life and legacy is critical to understanding the continuous conflict from which Israel and the Arab world still cannot escape. Husseini's strategizing of Arab terror was collated into the PLO we know and imagine as moderate today, and whose mission has not changed since its inception. Husseini meets with Hitler and the heads of the Nazi movement and becomes their official beneficiary. In the second part of today's discussion, we turn to the second half of that century to understand the origins of the much misused title Palestine, the telling changes made to the PLO's mission statement between 1964 and 1968, Husseini's PLO progeny in Yasser Arafat, and the story's connection to eugenics. These are the rotten fruits of a century of terrorism. Here is Professor Francisco Gil-White in part two of The Final Solution, Reframing 100 Years in the Land of Israel. I want to take the time to explain, first of all, the original, what you cite in your research, the original PLO Charter of 1964 and how it changes and why in 1968, and the history in brief of the word Palestine. There's a lot of dispute about who's really the Palestinian people and the roots of that.
Those two issues are actually related. The change in the PLO Constitution from 1964 to 1968. So the PLO has two constitutions. One from 1964 when it was founded, and one from 1968, which is right after the 1967 Six-Day War. And the definition of Palestine in those two constitutions changed, which is in and of itself a demonstration that Palestine is an arbitrary concept. Because if the organization that is supposed to represent the Arab Palestinians, the Palestine Liberation Organization, within the space of 3 years changes the territorial definition of Palestine, then obviously Palestine is just an artificial creation. So, and what definition did the PLO choose? That's interesting too. So in 1964, the original PLO charter defined Palestine as having the borders that were decided by the British colonial authorities. Now, if you really believe there is such a thing as an ancestral Arab Palestinian population, this should be shocking. Why should the organization that represents the supposedly millenarian Arab Palestinians, why should this organization choose to define its supposedly ancestral homeland, a definition created by the British Empire, by the infidel foreign colonial authority? That makes absolutely no sense. But the PLO had no choice, because before the British colonialists arrived in the Middle East, before they took that territory from the Ottoman Turks, there had been no territory called Palestine. The Arabs didn't use the word. The Turks didn't use the word. Palestine is a Western term. Palestine means land of the Philistines. And the Philistines were Greeks. The Philistines are the sea peoples that the Egyptians talk about in their hieroglyphs. And they had come from the Aegean, and they had settled themselves in the area that now contains Gaza City, and they had Greek culture. Those are the Philistines. They're not Arabs, they're Greeks. By the time that the Roman Empire decided to call that place Palestine, the Philistines no longer existed. They had disappeared from history. Why did the Romans call that place Palestine? Because the Romans had just concluded a great genocide of the Jewish people in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. This genocide was concluded in the year 135 when the Romans defeated Simon Bar Kokhba, also known as Bar Kokhba. He had managed to fight off the Romans in the Second Jewish War enough to recreate an independent Jewish state that lasted for about 3 years. But the Romans finally defeated Bar Kokhba, and with the defeat of Bar Kokhba, they concluded the long Roman genocide against the Jews, which historians estimate killed even more Jews than Adolf Hitler in proportional terms as a percentage of the population. And after that genocide, what the Romans tried to do was erase the Jewish connection with their own land. So what had been the province of Judea was now called Syria Palestina. They changed the name officially. And they changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. And they razed the city. They razed it completely. They destroyed everything. And they used the stones to build Greek buildings on top of the rubble. And they also had a policy of importing Greeks. They forbade the entrance of Jews to the city, and they imported Greeks to go settle in there because they had an ethnic cleansing program. That's the origin of the name Palestine for that place. But even the Romans had trouble calling it Palestine. So we have texts written in the 4th century where people say Palestine, which is to say Judea, so that people would know what you were saying, because Palestine had no cultural reality for people. But the Romans officially got used to saying Palestine. So the cultural descendants of the Romans, which is to say the European aristocracies, continued using the name Palestine to refer to what they considered their Holy Land, their Christian Holy Land. So that was an inheritance from the Romans. It was the Western European aristocracies that used the term Palestine, not the Arabs and not the Ottoman Turks. In the Ottoman Empire, there was no administrative unit called Palestine. It didn't exist. And there was no people that called themselves Arab Palestinians. If you go back and do historical research on the early stages of Mandate Palestine, and even up until the Declaration of Independence of the State of Israel, during all that time, the only ones to call themselves Palestinian were the Zionist Jews, because the place where they were going to build their homeland was called Palestine by the British. So they called themselves Palestinians. Only the Zionist Jews called themselves Palestinians up until the year 1964, which is when the Palestine Liberation Organization was created and the charter was elaborated. That's the beginning of some Arabs calling themselves Palestinians. Before that, nobody was doing that. So the PLO had no choice but to use the British definition of Palestine, because there was no other definition of Palestine. So even though it was absurd and ridiculous, they had no choice.
And what did the Ottomans and the Arabs who were in the area, how did they refer to it?
Oh, they considered that whole area part of Syria.
All part of Syria.
So the Bilad al-Sham is the term they used for that whole area. Now, very interesting fact is that in the definition of Palestine that the PLO used in 1964 for its original charter, they were careful to include an article to say that Judea and Samaria and Gaza were not included in the definition of Palestine. So they said, we're going to define Palestine according to the boundaries decided by the colonial British authorities, except for Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, which happen to be the very territories that they now claim for the proposed Palestinian state. So that's a second absurdity. Now, I have skipped over a third absurdity, which is that there were two British definitions of Palestine. So we have to explain why the Palestine Liberation Organization chose one British definition and not the other. Because in principle, if you're going to let the British colonialists define Palestine, well, you could pick and choose which one of the two British definitions you like the most, because there were two. So in 1920, the British defined Palestine as including all of what today is the Kingdom of Jordan. All of that, and what is today the State of Israel, was included in the first British definition of Palestine. And the initial mandate territory included all of what is today the Kingdom of Jordan. All of that territory was supposedly going to be for the Jewish homeland. In 1922, the British officially redefined Palestine. And what they did is that they separated the territory of what is now Jordan, and they called it Transjordan. Now, that was also a completely artificial territory. You can see it in the name. What does Transjordan mean? What does it mean? It just means the territory on the other side of the Jordan. That's all Transjordan means. It's not the name of an ethnic group or of a cultural area or of a traditional place or anything like that. All it means is the territory that's on the other side of the Jordan. That's all Transjordan means. So that territory was also arbitrarily created, and it was separated from the definition of Palestine in 1922. So now let's say you are a so-called Palestinian nationalist, right? And you want to, quote unquote, liberate Palestine. Well, the first intuition that anyone outside of this context would have is that you're going to choose the biggest definition of Palestine. Why would you want your territory, the one you're going to liberate for yourself, to run yourself, be the smaller territory and not the larger territory? So you'd think, oh, yeah, the Palestinian nationalists are going to argue that the British government should have never separated Transjordan from Palestine, and they're going to claim the whole thing. Well, no. The Palestine Liberation Organization chose the smaller territory that the British redefined in 1922 as the supposed ancestral Palestine. Well, the first absurdity is that they're relying on the British at all. The second absurdity is that they chose the smaller territory. And the third absurdity is that they made that territory even smaller by excluding from the definition with an explicit article the territories of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Now, the next question is, why would they do that? Why would they exclude Judea, Samaria, and Gaza in 1964 from the official definition of Palestine? And the reason is obvious. In 1964, when that charter was created, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza were not controlled by the State of Israel. Judea and Samaria were controlled by the Kingdom of Jordan, and Gaza was controlled by Egypt. If you know that the only purpose of the Palestine Liberation Organization is the genocidal destruction of the Israeli Jews, then this makes perfect sense. Under any other interpretation, it's absurd, right? So if the only purpose of the PLO is to destroy Israel in genocide, then it makes sense in 1964 to exclude Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, because you don't want to fight Jordan and you don't want to fight Egypt. You want them to support your effort to exterminate the Israeli Jews, because that's what all the Arab states surrounding Israel want. They declared it in public in 1948. So when the State of Israel was declared after the UN proposal of 1947, so that in 1947, the UN proposed, everybody always forgets this, 2 states, not one. The 1947 UN proposal was not to create a Jewish state. It was to create a Jewish state and an Arab state in what was left of the definition of Palestine. So in the smaller definition created in 1922, which is roughly equivalent to the State of Israel today, in that territory, the UN proposed to create 2 states, one for the Jews, which would now get only an eighth of what was originally promised to them, and one for the Arabs, a second Arab-Palestinian state, because since Arab Palestinians could only be created by a British sleight of hand, then the only place where you can find Arab Palestinians is wherever the British said that Palestine exists. So since the first British definition of Palestine included all of what is now Jordan, that means that the Kingdom of Jordan is a Palestinian state. And therefore, in 1947, the UN was proposing to create a second Palestinian state. Haj Amin al-Husseini, speaking for the Arab Palestinians without their consent, rejected the proposed Arab state in 1947. And Azam Pasha, who was his protege and also the Secretary General of the Arab League, announced in public that they didn't want an Arab state. What they wanted was to exterminate the Israeli Jews, and that they would launch, this is almost literally what he says, what Azam Pasha said, we will launch a momentous massacre and a war of extermination like the Mongolian massacres and the Crusades. That's what Azam Pasha, speaking for the Arab League, said in 1948. So once you understand that the purpose of these fanatical jihadi Arabs is the extermination of the Israeli Jews, once you understand that, then the definition that the PLO chose for Palestine makes perfect sense. Because the project to exterminate the Israeli Jews, which is dressed up as Palestinian liberation, requires that Palestine be defined as precisely that territory that the Jews control and nothing more. And that's why the definition of Palestine changes in 1968. Because what happens between 1964 and 1968 is the Six-Day War of 1967. And in those 6 days, what the Israeli Jews achieved was to recover Judea and Samaria and Gaza. And since the Israeli Jews ended up controlling Judea, Samaria, and Gaza after 1967, the Palestine Liberation Organization, in a big rush, had to change the definition of Palestine to include Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, because now this was part of the state of Israel. So it had to now be called Palestine, because the founding charter of PLO says that Palestine must be liberated through the use of force. The entire point of quote unquote liberating Palestine is to kill Jews.
It's just, it leaves me speechless. The clarity, it's like.
But who did it, Ilana? That's the most disquieting issue here, because what the Jews of the world were told and what the Israeli Jews were told was that this organization, PLO, which in 1970 became PLO Fatah, it essentially became Fatah. So starting in 1970, this organization, the PLO, is Husseini's organization. Exactly. And by the way, Husseini was still alive. And in 1968, as historians Wolfgang Svanitz and Barry Rubin documented in a book published just a few years ago, they documented with documents from Lebanese intelligence, they documented that in 1968, Husseini formally handed over the leadership of the Arab Palestinian movement to Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. There was a formal meeting in Lebanon in which Husseini did this. He handed over the movement to Arafat and Abbas. So this organization, PLO Fatah, which is Haj Amin al-Husseini's organization, in other words, it is the organization created by the Nazi exterminator of the European Jews. The Jews were told that this organization had become a proponent of peace, that they had seen the light, that they had changed their stripes, that they were now interested in negotiating a territory in exchange for peace. That's what they were told. And it was never explained to them that this organization had been created by Haj Amin al-Husseini and that Haj Amin al-Husseini had directed the Nazi death camps. That was not explained to them. That information was suppressed. In fact, when I found out about Husseini, this was in 2003, and I was doing my research at the University of Pennsylvania Library, where I found all of this stuff. When I started researching Husseini, there had been a few decades already of complete silence on Husseini, because Husseini was actually quite famous when the war ended. You should know that when Husseini was held in the outskirts of Paris in house arrest immediately after the war, there were British parliamentarians in the House of Commons screaming that Husseini had to be tried for crimes against humanity and war crimes at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. He was famous. When in the middle of the 1948 war, the US government decided to take back its recognition of the state of Israel. They did this because they thought the Israelis were going to lose the war. And so they took back recognition of Israel. And the minute they did that, there was a gigantic protest in New York. All kinds of people came from all parts of the United States to protest that. And they were chanting against Haj Amin al-Husseini by name in the streets. Husseini was famous. And there was an entire book written by Maurice Perlman in 1948, after the war, on Husseini, explaining Husseini's role in the war. And then there was another book by this guy, Shechtman, in the 1960s, also on Husseini and his role in the final solution. But after this, after the 60s, a complete and total silence ensued on Husseini, and no academic and no members of the big media ever mentioned him again in connection with the Nazi final solution, or even they ceased talking about him at all. So
do we think that that's because if we're to take Yasser Arafat as the head of the PLO seriously and any sort of attempts to live peaceably next to each other, then we need to erase Husseini and his entire founding of the organization?
That's what I believe. If the Jews of the diaspora and the Jews in Israel had understood perfectly, because it had been part of their education, which it wasn't, that Husseini was the founding father of the Arab-Palestinian movement and also the architect of the German Nazi final solution, and also the founder of Al-Fatah, the very organization that the United States government and other European governments and Arab governments were proposing to bring into the Jewish state. If all the Jews had understood that, nobody would have supported the Oslo process that brought PLO Fatah into Israel to govern the Arabs in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. Nobody would have supported that. The Oslo process would have been impossible. Total silence on Husseini and his Nazi role were imperative to get this diplomatic process going. The demonstration is that when I published my investigation of Husseini, my history of the Arab-Palestinian movement, which included all of these details about Husseini, I was fired from the University of Pennsylvania. Wow. And they told me, you can't say this, because I challenged them. Before they fired me, they would threaten me. They said, you can't say this. Why are you saying this? Blah, blah, blah. And I said, well, I can't say this. What in the world are you talking about? You hired me because I'm an expert in ethnic conflict. And this is an ethnic conflict. I'm researching an ethnic conflict. I'm doing the very job you are paying me to do. What do you mean I can't say this? Why would I want to say lies? I'm a social scientist. I'm interested in figuring out what happened. So if you believe that I either lied or made a mistake or even exaggerated something, give me the documentation that refutes me, and tomorrow I will retract myself in public. And they replied, no, your documentation is impeccable. They used that word, impeccable. They said, but you can't say this because it could hurt the peace process. Can you believe that? Hurting the peace process is exactly what this information should do. So they said, and if you insist in saying this, you're going to have to get yourself another job. So I did.
It's incredible because I can't think of a more lucrative brand than the Palestine-Israel conflict. There was a sort of random book that a neighbor was getting rid of. It was a man, Tuvia Tenenbaum, and he was making rounds. Yeah, he was making rounds around the UK and finding in absolutely destitute islands stands and offices with keffiyeh wearing advocates for this completely arbitrary issue.
Why do they care?
So to speak. Why do they care? Why is this above all? We can certainly, spend hours and next time on why the Jews, but let's recognize the phenomenon first.
Yeah. It's incredible that people in, say, Mexico City care at all about this issue. Why do you care about Palestine? You don't care about Thailand. You don't care about Mongolia. You don't care about Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. And the answer is they care about Palestine because they've been indoctrinated over several decades at the universities that caring about Palestine is the way to signal your virtue as a good leftist. This is the flag that you have to raise so that other leftists will recognize you as a good leftist. Mongolia doesn't matter. Thailand doesn't matter. What matters is Palestine. It's virtue signaling. So once this indoctrination has happened, everybody feels obligated, in order to stay in good standing with their fellow leftists, to raise the Palestinian flag. But why did the universities do this? That's the next question. And that brings us back to the topic of eugenics. You can see this. There are academics that study the structure of the boards of trustees of Western universities, for example. There's a guy called Thomas Dye who's become famous doing this kind of work. And what Thomas Dye has found is that the people at the top of the industrial system of the US are the people running the boards of trustees of both private and public universities. And it so happens that the biggest industrialists in the United States in the first half of the 20th century were eugenicists. And eugenics is the movement that produced German Nazism. So before Germany became the world center of eugenics, the world center of eugenics was the United States. And the fortunes of John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, and a few others were financing the growth of the eugenics movement. Eugenics is the original ideology that claims biological superiority for Germanic, Aryan, Nordic stock. That's the original movement. And eugenics was institutionalized on US soil in the first half of the 20th century. It was very successful. Many laws were passed in different states, allowing authorities to either incarcerate or forcibly sterilize or unmarry people on the basis of not having sufficient Germanic blood, which was assessed with IQ tests. Entirely fraudulent IQ tests were used to decide that somebody didn't have enough Germanic blood because they were allegedly low on intelligence and therefore didn't have enough Germanic blood, and they would put them in these special prisons. The great historian of the eugenics movement is Edwin Black, who rescued, I recently, just this past week, I brought Edwin Black to Mexico to give conferences because he's very important. Without Edwin Black, you can't understand what World War II was. You just can't. I mean, he's not the only historian of eugenics, but the same thing happened with eugenics as had happened with Haj Amin al-Husseini. People had stopped talking about it. And so the model that is taught in schools, the story of the war that people learn in school is that, the Nazis were bad, but the Western Allied governments were good. And the Western Allied governments fought the Nazis to liberate, Europeans and especially the Jews from the clutches of the Nazis. And the entire story of eugenics, which is the story of these same power elites in the West promoting eugenics and then promoting it and financing it in Germany, where they created the German Nazi movement, that all of that is suppressed. Nobody learns that in school. At the University of Pennsylvania, after coming in contact with Edwin Black's work and learning about eugenics, I would run the test with my students. I would ask them, raise your hand if you've heard about eugenics. They didn't even have to explain it. They just had to recognize the word. Almost nobody moved. In the country where eugenics was the most important movement, right, in the first half of the 20th century, where it was institutionalized, legally institutionalized, they don't know about it. So, of course, if you don't know about eugenics, you can be sold this story about how the Allied powers fought the Nazis. Right, they fought the Nazis after the Soviets defeated the Nazis, when it became a matter of securing for yourself at least some chunk of Europe and not give it all to the Soviets. That's when they fought the Nazis. But before that, they were actually supporting the Nazis. There was a lot of trading with the enemy. There's a wonderful book by Charles Hyham, a British historian, called Trading with the Nazis, where he documents how these big American industrialists were supplying the German Nazis with war material and financing even after Pearl Harbor, after Pearl Harbor. Right. And another example is IBM. That's another book, Edwin Black book. It's called IBM and the Holocaust. IBM was responsible for capturing all the data that was needed to identify where all of the German Jews were and what their professions were and what they were doing and blah, 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 and processing all of the information needed to find and exterminate these people. They had IBM Hollerith machines in all of the death camps, and IBM specialists were helping the German Nazis to process all of the information needed to murder the European Jews. So that context is needed to understand the post-war policy. So why would the US government organize a diplomatic process called the peace process, quote unquote, to introduce into the Jewish state the very organization that was created by the Nazi exterminator of the European Jews and created to exterminate the Israeli Jews? Well, the obvious explanation is that the eugenicists who were in power before the war are still in power after the war.
Exactly.
Nobody removed them. This model also explains other very dramatic facts. So, for example, Nazi Germany was never denazified after the war. Never happened. I could give you many, many, many examples, but I won't go into all of the details. There's a book written by All the President's Men, written by the very guy who was supposed to be participating in the denazification, and nobody let him do it. So he wrote a whole book denouncing what the U.S. government was doing. He said, they're putting the Nazis back in power. No, right. This guy was denouncing that in Germany after the war, they were dressing up the Nazis with, suits and ties and calling them Christian Democrats. That's the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union. That's the party that dominated Germany after the war. So they were dressing the former Nazis as Christian Democrats and putting them back in power. But the one detail that is quite sufficient and totally diagnostic about what they were doing, and for this you need a different historian, that's Christopher Simpson, who wrote a very important book called Blowback, where he documents that U.S. intelligence was created by recruiting at least tens of thousands and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Nazis and Nazi collaborators. That's how the CIA was created. And initially, they created something called the Gehlen Org, which had its headquarters in Pullach, which is a suburb of Munich. And the Gehlen Org was run by Reinhard Gehlen, who had been the chief of intelligence of Fremde Heer Ost, which is to say the Nazi armies in the East, the ones that fought the Soviet Union. Reinhard Gehlen was a monster who tortured to death millions of people to get intelligence from them. Some of them were starved to death in the Eastern Front. Many, many people were starved to death just by preventing food from reaching them. And this monster, Reinhard Gehlen, at the end of the war, he had all the information. He hid it in tanks. He had all the information needed to reconstruct the Nazi intelligence system in Eastern Europe. So what the US government did is, instead of trying Reinhard Gehlen for war crimes and crimes against humanity in Nuremberg, they recruited him and had him recreate the entire intelligence infrastructure of the Nazis. And as I said, they called that the Gehlen Org, and it had its headquarters in Pullach, a suburb of Munich. Now, the diagnostic fact is not only that, but the fact that in 1954, the US government told the government of Konrad Adenauer that from 1954 onwards, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, that is to say, the BND, the West German equivalent of the CIA, would be run by the Gehlen Org. The Gehlen Org would become the BND. In other words, Reinhard Gehlen, this Nazi general, this Nazi monster, became the head of West German intelligence in 1954. Obviously, the US was still being run by the same eugenicists. And the fact that they invented the Oslo process to introduce a genocidal organization to become the government over the Arabs in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, in the Jewish state, which was created to protect the Jews from Nazis. That is perfectly diagnostic, perfectly revealing of the real ideology of the people who run the United States system.
It's absolutely mind-blowing, the recalibration that you take us on.
This was an explosion for my own mind when I started documenting all of this. I used to be on the other side. It's important for your audience to know this. I was pro-PLO. Before 2003, I was pro-PLO. I was in favor of a two-state solution. I wrote a piece that went around the world condemning the Western media for not being sufficiently pro-PLO. And it went viral. It was copied all over the place because leftists who wanted to signal their virtue felt that I was doing their job for them. So they reposted the piece everywhere. That was me. I changed my mind when I understood the history of the Zionist movement and the history of the Arab-Palestinian movement and the relationship that the Arab-Palestinian movement had to the German Nazi final solution. That's when I changed my mind. This information is very powerful. And that's why I had to be fired. because I was working at one of the most prestigious universities in the world as an expert on ethnic conflict at a think tank called the Solomon Asch Center for Study of Ethnopolitical Conflict that was dedicated to studying, among other things, the Arab-Israeli conflict. So if from that prestige perch, I said all of the things I'm telling you now, well, that had the potential to change many, many minds and to undermine, as the people who fired me told me, the Oslo peace process. So this is very, very powerful information. And I haven't even told you the cherry on top. Here's the cherry on top. People also don't know this because it has also been suppressed in media and academia. PLO Fatah, Yasser Arafat, and Mahmoud Abbas are the creators of the theocratic, jihadi Iranian regime of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. That's the regime that took power in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, when the Shah of Iran was deposed by jihadi guerrillas, and Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini became the supreme leader of Iran. That was possible because in the 1970s, Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas and the rest of PLO Fatah trained Khomeini's guerrillas in Lebanon. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini was so grateful for the role of the Palestinian movement in creating modern jihadi Iran that the very first dignitaries invited to Tehran to celebrate with Khomeini the Iranian Revolution were Yasser Arafat and Mahmoud Abbas. Ayatollah Khomeini sent an airplane to pick them up and bring them to Tehran so they could celebrate with him the Iranian Revolution. And Yasser Arafat was received by the jihadi Iranian crowds as the Mahdi, which is the Muslim equivalent of the Messiah. The people were fighting among themselves to try to steal a piece of Arafat's kafiyeh as a kind of relic, as a saint's relic. That was the prestige that these people enjoyed in Iran immediately after the Iranian Revolution. And they became kind of, for a while, they functioned as the foreign ministry of Iran because they were actually involved in the negotiations to release the hostages in the American embassy in Tehran. And they played an outsized role helping Ayatollah Khomeini create the Iranian secret services, which oppressed the Iranian people, and also the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which is the organ that created Hezbollah and that exports Iranian terrorism all over the world. PLO Fatah did all of that. And this, by the way, everything I just told you about PLO Fatah's role in the Iranian Revolution was on the front page of the New York Times in the period 1979-1981. It was no secret. Front page of the New York Times. When they decided a few years later, starting in 1987, let's say, that they would create a process to bring PLO Fatah into Israel, that's when they stopped talking completely. Actually, they must have decided it earlier because the silence on the relationship between Iran and PLO Fatah began around 1983. That's when the last newspaper articles appeared that ever mentioned this. And that was totally necessary because you can't bring PLO Fatah into Israel if the Israeli public knows either that PLO Fatah comes from Haj Amin al-Husseini or that PLO Fatah created Iran, which in public promises to exterminate the Israeli Jews. If you know either of those two facts, you can't have an Oslo peace process. So both needed to be suppressed. And they did suppress the relationship between Iran and PLO Fatah. That's how they did it.
I don't have a single word to add because I think it's absolutely crucial that people listen and go and check for themselves.
But we have to go to the end. I have to give you the last item.
Please.
The last item concerns the Israeli leadership. What have they been doing? Because PLO Fatah cannot enter Israel without the consent of the Israeli government. And the Israeli government cannot do this without the consent of the ordinary Israelis. So the Israeli government had to lie to ordinary Israelis to get this done. All of this could have been stopped with one press conference. The Israeli prime minister calls an international press conference. All the media arrives because all of the media always wants to know what's going on in Israel. It's the most important item of news in the entire world, what's going on in Israel. So if the prime minister of Israel calls an international press conference, all of the media will show up. And it has to be a live conference for this to work. So if an Israeli prime minister had done an international press conference and then with all the media collected in front of him had said, look, we're not going to have an Oslo peace process because PLO Fatah was created by Haj Amin al-Husseini, and this is what Husseini did. And then after the war, PLO Fatah created Iran, which is promising to exterminate us. Therefore, bringing PLO Fatah into Israel to run the lives of the Arabs in Judea, Samaria, and Gaza is the same thing as giving Judea, Samaria, and Gaza to the German Nazis and to the Iranian jihadists. Therefore, this will never happen. If such a press conference had been given, that would have been the end of any kind of pressure on Israel to introduce PLO Fatah into the Jewish state. So why wasn't this done? Why instead were Israeli leaders telling Israeli Jews that PLO Fatah had supposedly had a conversion experience and was now interested in peace? Why? And the guy who did this was Netanyahu, the same guy who vaccinated the Israeli Jews. Netanyahu is the guy who went to the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991. He did it. It was the Israeli right that did this. Yitzhak Shamir was the prime minister at the time. Yitzhak Shamir didn't get along with the foreign minister. It was Levy. I don't know if it was Michael Levy. Anyway, some guy, Levy. And Shamir didn't get along with Levy, and Levy didn't speak English. So Shamir went to the Madrid Peace Conference in 1991 with the undersecretary for foreign affairs, which was Benjamin Netanyahu. And Netanyahu was the big star of the Madrid Peace Conference of 1991. And it was at that peace conference that Netanyahu broke for the first time the sacred taboo of Israeli politics. You will not negotiate with PLO Fatah. That was a sacred taboo, and he broke it. He was the first to enter into negotiations with PLO Fatah. And on the basis of those negotiations was built the negotiation process at Oslo that created the Oslo peace process only a couple of years later. Remember that the first Oslo signature is 1993. Which means that the negotiations for the Oslo signature began immediately after Netanyahu pioneered the negotiations with PLO Fatah in 1991 in Madrid. And most Israelis don't understand this. So you need to ask yourselves what your own leadership is doing. Because it's not the left, it's the left and the right, all together. The only one who ever told Israelis the truth about Husseini and the final solution is Moshe Feiglin. And he did that after I pressured him. He's the only one.
I think that there are probably no truer words to summarize what you've brought to us today, in that the left and the right are both the problem. I think that what has become abundantly clear to all we, the people of the earth, is that our governments do not act in our sovereign interests. But I think that that is the value of actually learning history from recorded testimony and not TikTok, is that
right.
There's a whole lot. What's so valuable about what you bring is not only what it does personally and to the Jewish community and to the Israeli community, but to bring coherence to the world is what is more desperately needed than I think anything else, because the past 4 years, certainly it's been a lead up, but the past 4 years have been a relentless.
It was a long time coming.
It has been channel of relentless fear and terror on all channels, right? And so the only way to get out of it is to work our way back and to take thread of documented truth and to realign it, which is exactly the intention both of this initiative and of having you on. I feel that it's a genuine gift. To say I encourage would be an understatement of the century. It's imperative that everyone go to your site and read your work and look at your copious footnotes and references to discover for themselves. I feel that on one hand, we met a monster who needed his due place back in history. And really with you, I feel we meet a real heroic act of telling the truth, which in today's world, that is what heroism looks like, in my opinion. And
Orwell had a phrase that I like. He said, in a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. And that's one of my slogans, actually.
Yeah. Right.
And you
Please.
mentioned that we might have a second installment. If we do, then we should talk about why the Jews, because that's very important. Once this whole structure is assimilated into a person's understanding, the first question that they ask is, but why? Why this gigantic investment to destroy the Jews? And the short answer is that these people, the eugenicists, are totalitarians. They want to enslave all of us. And it turns out that the Jewish movement, which is based on the founding myth of a slave revolt, that's what the story of Exodus is. So the story of Exodus is the story of the origin of Jewish law. And the political context of the origin of Jewish law is a slave revolt. The Israelites were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, and with the help of God, they organized a slave revolt, escaped to Sinai, and once in Sinai, they are given a new law. What law is this? This is the law of the escaped slaves. It's a law designed to ensure that nobody will ever be oppressed again. And that's what the Jewish movement is. It's the original movement that fights against oppression. And that's why the impact of the Jewish movement in Western history has been to move Western societies in the direction of humanitarianism and democracy. So we can talk in more detail about that next time we meet, but I know that this is the question that everybody's going to have in their minds after hearing everything we just discussed. So it's important to at least give them the outline of the answer. The reason for anti-Semitism, the reason that mass killings of Jews have been organized for 25 centuries is that the people organizing the mass killings of Jews want all of us to be their slaves, whether they're Greco-Macedonians or whether they are Romans or whether they are Catholic inquisitors, or whether they are Russian boyars, or whether they are German Nazis. They all want to enslave the totality of humanity. And they understand, because they are fanatics of the study of history, they understand that the Jewish movement is the movement that stands in their way. And this is why they mobilize anti-Jewish propaganda and try to organize mass killings of Jews. What they're trying to do is interrupt the process of the generational transmission of the Torah, because they understand that the Torah and everything that springs from the Torah helps people fight oppression.
I mean, I'm deeply moved. I'm just saying this is on a personal level. Got the formula, just send it over, because
the formula is what you're doing. You've got the formula. The formula is the podcast revolution. Podcast, what you're doing, Westerners, thanks to the podcast revolution and to the blog revolution, we are communicating directly with each other. We're going around the media and we're communicating directly with each other. And this is what Westerners have to do. If telling the truth is a revolutionary act right now, because we live in a world of universal deceit, then to be a revolutionary right now, to fight for the future right now for ordinary people, means share this podcast. Make sure that everybody knows what we just discussed. Make sure that everybody has a chance to enlighten themselves and step outside of this bubble of managed reality that we are living in. So thank you for inviting people to my website. It's managementofreality.com. As you said, we have a lot of documented work there that you shouldn't believe. You should go check it. Whenever I say something that's outlandish or outrageous in your opinion, then by all means, try to prove that I'm wrong. This is the only way to be confident that you're actually gaining a better understanding of the world, is try to prove me wrong. And if you do find a mistake, then please send me a message, because I will correct it. And I'm sure I've made some mistakes. Everybody does. But I think the general model is solid, and the overwhelming majority of my documentation is good. But you should reach that determination on your own. So go try to prove me wrong. And when you've satisfied yourself that we are producing a better model of how the world works, then make sure you talk to other people and bring them into the fold, because Westerners will not be safe until millions of Westerners understand this and call to account their own leaders and rulers.
That's exactly right, because that is ultimately the lesson that the Jews bring. You don't have to like us. You can hate us, but you must understand that I find that we're the buffer between the terrorism that knocks in your door that people have absolutely and thankfully no idea of from sofas in New Jersey.
You've always been that. You've always been the movement that fights oppression. Yeah. And when people understand that, they will love you, because people love their own freedom.
We have this on repeat. I mean, everybody's got all of these cliches, the canary in the coal mine. The point is love or hate us, we are the signal that the decay in society is at a breaking point. And
Yeah, but
that's why you pay
this has
attention.
to stop now. It
This
has to
has to
stop. We
stop.
have to win.
Amen to
We
that.
have to win because the world has globalized. And so if we
Exactly.
lose this one, we lose everything. If we win this one,
Exactly.
we win everything. So
Exactly.
Westerners have to understand that this generation is the generation that will either save or lose the planet. This is the generation. There is no other. We will not get another opportunity, and the opportunity is not a bad one. We do have the tools to communicate freely with each other. We must use them before they take them away from us. We have to turn the system around, and the way we do it, the first step is to communicate with each other, share this knowledge, because people won't know what to do if they don't know what world they live in.
Exactly. It brings us right back to the what you were talking about, these early tyrants. If they had the tools that we have today, we wouldn't have gotten to here. And now that those tools, it's the flip side. They were created for good. The good is the communication, and the bad is obviously the psychological warfare that's being waged.
That's right. So we have to fight that psychological warfare, communicating amongst ourselves, showing each other the evidence, and bringing more and more people into the fold.
Amen.
Amen.
Professor Francisco Gil-White, may your research go far and wide. Everyone go to managementofreality.com. God bless and thank you.
All right, and let's do this again.
Thank you. Oh man, I can't wait for next time. I
Okay.
cannot wait. Awesome.
Talk to you soon, Ilana.
Thank you so much. Really, God bless.
Bye-bye.